All right. I'm excited to get this kicked off here. We are not starting slow. So our first session is on the changing future of youth sports. And we're going to kick this off with a keynote discussion on the coming disruption, which is going to be led by Naima Raza. And Naima is a producer and journalist who is at the New York Times. And she's now the executive producer of On with Kara Swisher, a brand new podcast from Vox and New York Magazine. She's not just producing, but she's actually a co-host for the show. I think she's been described as the goose to Kara's Maverick, which I think is appropriate because we got the top gun of panels to kick today off. She's also a Georgetown grad, I should mention that, as a Georgetown grad myself. And she will be joined by Paul Rabel, an early League Apps investor and entrepreneur who co-founded the PLL in addition to playing in it, and Josh Wolf, who's the co-founder, managing partner at Lux Capital. The floor is yours, John. Thank you.
I'm just glad they gave me a high chair.
You're fine. I brought my heels. I think I'm the only person here wearing high heels today. Is this working? Okay, great. Thank you guys for being here. Very excited to be on a panel with you two who are far more sporty than myself. So I got a bit of a longer introduction here, and I'd love you guys to kind of speak briefly about what you do and why you're here today.
Josh Wolf, co-founder of Lux Capital. We are a $4 billion fund between New York and Menlo Park. We do pretty cutting-edge, crazy stuff. So I would say that the gap between sci-fi and sci-fact is shrinking, and a lot of the stuff that we fund ranges from robots to drones to aerospace and defense to biotech, and then more mundane stuff in our world, which is artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all kinds of things that bleed into software and applications, human performance, measurement, and everything in between. So if it seems like it's cutting edge, if it seems like it's not going to work, it's the kind of thing that is a whistle for us. I'm a native of Coney Island, Brooklyn, and live in Tribeca. I've got 3 kids who are part of the Dusk, downtown United Soccer Club, and I think Kevin McCarthy is here, who helps run that, and just absolutely enthralled by what you all do and make possible for our kids.
So I've only listened to him talk through YouTube, and it's going to be like that for most of the time.
I promise I'll try to speed up and speak a little bit faster.
So Paul Rabel, I played lacrosse for most of my life. I launched the Premier Lacrosse League. His fund, Lux, is a $4 billion fund that he manages. We're trying to be a $4 billion league. I guess that's what we have in common. You're there, I'm trying to get there.
You will.
But most proudly, League Apps investor, early stage, Jeremy, Brian. Benita, it's awesome to see you again, and I love just bringing it back to accessibility and Nelson Mandela's quote. And then there's someone here who's been with League Apps from the beginning. His name's Rohit, and he was first giving me materials around investing in League Apps, and I think he's responsible for like $800 million in transactions for League Apps partners, which is largely people here. So really cool to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. So the concept I was told by Jeremy for this panel is really inspired by this Wayne Gretzky quote, which is skate to where the puck is going, not to where it's been. And so what we're going to be talking about today is technology. And having kind of I went to Stanford for business school, and I always found it funny that people talked about tech as an industry, because it's really much more of an infrastructure that touches every aspect of life. So I want to talk a little bit about that and kind of how various trends that we're seeing will impact the businesses that each of you are running or supporting today, and really the future of what kids are doing and what youth sports looks like. So Josh, you've used this framework, which I think is interesting, which is the innovation or investment as the intersection between 2 arrows, inevitability and impossibility. So I want to focus you could give us a little bit of a framework for what that means, and then I want to talk about some of the inevitable trends.
Sure, and by the way, I think this is a construct or framework for human performance as well. For the arrow of impossibility is people that don't believe, people that think that thing will never work, it's impossible. And as an investor, you actually want to find people that believe that, because it means that whatever you're talking about is going to be undervalued, because the consensus view is that it ain't gonna work. So we wanna see people doubting something, and then we have a counter view. We've got conviction, we actually believe. And it's the same thing if you're a coach, if you're an athlete, somebody doesn't believe in you, we'll probably talk about the human performance and psychological aspects of that. The arrow of inevitability is just being a student, is being a humble student to history and looking at these trends that you see. If I was talking about lighting, you would look at lights and say, okay, we went from candles to incandescent bulbs, to compact fluorescent lights, to LEDs, light emitting diodes. We are not going back to torches and sconces that are hanging on our walls. There's an inevitability that we're not going back to. You look at transportation, we went from people walking to riding horses, to horse-drawn carriages, to cars, to electric cars, to autonomous electric cars. We're not going back to horses in the streets. So when you find that arrow of inevitability, you get on it. And when it intersects with the arrow of impossibility, when people doubt that thing, as an investor, you can make a lot of money. So one of the inevitabilities here, particularly at the intersection of sports and tech, is the way that media is consumed and broadcast. We are not going back from a central broadcast of 3 networks.
Right.
You know, we now have distributed social media everywhere.
Yeah, so that's the first trend I want to get into. And Paul, maybe you can talk a little bit about that. That's, I think, the one that's easiest to grok in a way. So this move from TV and linear and how we used to consume media to streaming, and now to social media being really a kind of, not just a kind of channel around, but a real distribution channel in its own right, and have real monetization behind it. So Paul, you've been at the center of that.
Sure, yeah, and there's a lot to unpack, so I'll try to be brief, but I do want to say the arrow of inevitability, and entrepreneurs, and many of you all, you have to really have that speculative idea, that abstract sense of what could be, and people look at you and they doubt you. And I think it was Henry Ford who basically said, if that wasn't my mindset, we'd still be on horses.
Totally.
But I think if you think about maybe the trajectory of pro sports, I'll use it in clumps. Traditional media is television, print, radio. But before television, it was really just print, and then after print was radio. And Major League Baseball that created kind of the location model around ballparks, and all of that. The generation trended differently than today's generation does. They really capitalized on distribution of print and then radio. And then the NFL in the 60s and 70s were the sport of television. And what we looked at harnessing in basically an open canvas of what could professional sports look like today if they started in 2020 versus the early 1900s, where we have this new piece of technology and media called social that allows us to reach our audience much more efficiently and from a cost standpoint as well. So we really try to be the league of social media. And we could talk about the statistics, and if we want to dig in there, we could, but related to television and streaming, I think it's interesting in entrepreneurship. We innovate and we create new ways of going about our businesses more effectively and more efficiently, but a lot of times it becomes cyclical. So there's a lot of conversation around television and cable and cord cutting, and then streaming. And what's great about streaming, just like social media, is a direct to consumer, just like each of your businesses. The most value lives with word of mouth still. That will always, I think, be the most perennial form of marketing. But if you think about cable, is really a bundle. And it's like going to a restaurant and sign up for all you can eat and not really getting a choice, but just choosing the stuff that you like, and you're paying for the other stuff. And streaming is now direct to consumer, where you get a menu, you get to actually choose and pay for what you want, but you're still, from a cost standpoint, you get the same. I think right now, US households, there's about 110 million that have streaming services, and rough estimate, the same number of households with cable. And so we're starting to reach that moment, but I do think as streaming continues to grow, we'll get back to a bundle of streaming services.
But let's talk about that. So NFL, for example, just signed a $110 billion deal for streaming rights, right? I think everything except Sunday Ticket. I think now we're in a really unique moment of pressure on content, pressure on the economy. You're a money guy. I mean, do we think that social media monetization will ever catch up to that level? I mean, will TV always exist, particularly for sports, because that's really where I think if you're NBC, ABC, CBS, that's the most protected, spot on your programming.
Well, I think the only reason, or one of the main reasons why social media, from an advertising standpoint, hasn't completely eclipsed the other mediums is regulatory environment, and what we have is like we call native ad reads. And so you do this with Kara, but it actually goes back to kind of the OG of terrestrial radio and Howard Stern. And he was the first to explore advertising reads through his own experience at home and around the world, and then his listeners couldn't tell if he was endorsing a product or speaking authentically, so now we have to disclose that, and that's
Yeah.
what social media has when you have to tag if it's an endorsed product or whatever. But I do think, with advertising that lived traditionally in sports through television and distribution channels, there was a huge barrier to enter that, and it was expensive. And what social media does is just break that barrier down and allow us to advertise to an audience in a more efficient and lower rate.
To your question on the economics, I do think it's going to happen, but the difference is instead of the economics being captured centrally by the networks,
Right.
it's actually going to become increasingly distributed. It's going to be player-first leagues, it's going to be people that are building their own personal brands that they historically have never been able to, and that's starting to trickle down from pros to athletes and amateurs,
Yeah.
and the blurring, dissolving demarcation behind that. The other quick piece of this is that the democratization of the tools of production. There are many entrepreneurs, and I met a few earlier this morning, that are providing the tools. It used to be you needed a Chiron machine, you needed Avid Video to do crazy production,
Right.
and the kind of money that you needed to have a studio to be able to do that, and the level of the cameras that you needed, all of that has become democratized. Now, the average person, or slightly above average person, can go onto a field, capture and produce professional quality video, highlight reels, special effects, overlays that heretofore were never accessible to the mainstream, and I think that the rate of innovation in that is only going to accelerate.
Yeah.
And I think like philosophically, when we think about that turn, is I was fortunate to have graduated Johns Hopkins in 2008. So it was right when Facebook had turned their friend platform to a fan platform.
Right.
It's when there were really just cat videos on YouTube at the time, maybe some trick shots, and it was before Twitter and Instagram and TikTok. And so the consumption on those platforms was much different. It was very novel to be able to follow an athlete or an entertainer or a brand. So you were just giving everyone follows because it was just so cool. And that was the democratizing of it. And as we've gotten further down the road and it's become more ubiquitous to have a social media profile, it's become a social identification card, so people are far more selective. So while it's never been easier to launch a brand or a product or service and get it out there, it's actually gotten really difficult to build an audience, more difficult than ever, which is similar trend, just different from a cost standpoint of how to get on TV,
Right.
how to get on the traditional distribution platform.
So let's talk about kind of how this shift in power really is what we're talking about. There's been this shift in power toward the athlete as a content creator, the athlete as a monetization engine, and not just the athlete, but the sports league, the brand, however you want to think about it. And the biggest change here in recent days has been the NIL decision, the Supreme Court decision to allow school athletes to participate, to profit off of their own name, image, and likeness. And so I want to talk a little bit about how that is changing the world of sports and how that will trickle down really to youth sports and affect the people in this room and the leagues in this room.
At a very high level, everybody knows that a year ago, roughly, there was a Supreme Court decision that basically gave a win to a litigant who was opposing the NCAA for widespread participation for the right of college athletes to monetize their name, identity, and likeness. What's really interesting is if you look and listen to what Paul just said about the ability for people to monetize and build a brand. If you look at Paige Bucher at UConn, if you look at Olivia Dunn at LSU, a gymnast, these are people that are building millions of followers. They have the charisma and the athleticism and the talent and would have been totally neglected before. So I think that this is a phenomenon that is going to increase equality amongst athletes that weren't at the best school or weren't at the best program that was able to develop people into professional leagues. And I think you're going to see a further democratization of that that's going to be really interesting.
Yeah. Paul, what do you think?
Yeah, I used to love listening to Scott Galloway talk about, this recommendation. He teaches that in NYU Stern. It was a recommendation to his students, and he was like, overnight successes, Kardashians, Michael Jordan, Tom Brady. Assume you're not them. Okay, now what? And some of the people that you referenced, and great. And if you have one of those in your program, just let them do what they do. And so what you can do as a program operator is understand the pressure on athletes, especially those in the NIL era, now is just far greater than just being the best. I got to grow up and just try to be the best lacrosse player I wanted to be, and there was no other distractions. All this stuff is very distracting. There's a lot of opportunity to it. So if I'm an operator in this space and involved in youth, I'm trying to bifurcate it into my on-field approach. So that's purely the growth of being a great player and having a great relationship that's tied to mostly coaches empathetically connecting with their athletes. And then what you're doing off the field. And I would try to take as much weight off the players of that as possible. So if you're in the business of trying to understand how to monetize across your social for your programs, then I would think about bringing on a light production social media group that can do that for the athletes. And in some cases, when I say for the athletes, create it for them and then share it, or in some cases, maybe share it on their behalf across their channels. It's something that Major League Baseball and the NHL are doing, something that we do at the PLL, and I think that was the approach. The other thing that I would say is a ton of attention to NIL and how much money these athletes can make. But in the end, as an athlete at the lacrosse, in the lacrosse industry, for a long time competing at the highest level, I learned that endorsements are really just reserved for the top 2 or 3 women or men in their respective disciplines. And that's your endemic brands. So in lacrosse, it's the equipment companies and the footwear brands, and maybe a sports drink. If you go non-endemic, so if you're looking at financial services, hospitality, travel, then you're competing across disciplines, and I stood no chance against Tom Brady, LeBron James, Megan Rapinoe, and co.
Right.
So kind of understanding that there's a lot of attention here, but really the winners in NIL are those stars, and like just maybe exhale a little bit and know where that is. If you have one, cool, help build that enterprise value.
Paul said something interesting, by the way, because I'm sure we're going to talk about a bunch of different technology areas.
Yeah.
But what I think I heard you say was the empathy of the coach.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is
The
something
human
that
aspect
we
of
shouldn't
this.
lose aspect, even though I'm
Yeah.
super bullish on progress in technology and science and cutting edge stuff. Is there are certain things that just can't be measured, can't be tracked, can't be captured by a technology, no matter what my deep engineering friends would say. We were talking about this before. If you watch the latest clip of Kobe at the Olympics when he's going up against Powell, and he literally, I mean, you see this online, he just like powers through his chest, like that intensity. You were talking about sharing with me a story about Jordan, and if you were to track his
wearable tech, his heart rate, his muscle depletion during games, he'd somehow get better in the fourth quarter and overtime, which is counterintuitive to the data.
Yeah.
and then he's got this flu game where you'd expect that like it's telling you he's crapping out, and the intensity is just something that it can't be captured in
So,
technology.
yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. So data, this has been a huge kind of shift. Everybody in the world has wearables, has monitoring. Is this a good thing, Paul? Like overall, what do you think? Is it a good thing for sports?
I think perspective is everything, right? You can have an unhealthy vegan diet. You can work out too much. You can drown yourself to death if you overhydrate drinking 2 gallons of water a day. So it's like perspective and understanding tolerance. So I think with data related to sports and related to business, you can be overly analytical, and if you are that, you probably strip that ambition around innovation and bending the area of inevitability.
Absolutely.
So I think like understanding, whether it's software to grow your business and how you're being more analytical, to reviews of, in our case, our coaches, our players, 360 with our colleagues. There's software that helps enhance that and make it better. Even recruiting, there's software now that you record interviews, you can review them, you can test viability of candidates. So all that is great. And then the wearable tech, whether it's a Whoop band or a Fitbit, learning high performance standards and how to improve your sleep and eating and what your body likes to consume and digest versus doesn't. Take that, kind of put it in a box, put it back on the shelf, and then when you're on the field, kind of block it out and just do what you do.
Okay,
I was 2 nights ago. I was with Daryl Morey watching Nets Sixers, and he's brought Moneyball to basketball, and he's able to look and say, okay, that guy's going to shoot 74% from right there, and the statistics and the analysis of that. What I thought was fascinating was the hidden statistics that can reveal great players, and sort of the
What do you mean
economic.
by hidden statistics?
The people that are looking at conventional statistics in the same way, to put it in an investment analogy, people are looking at all the ratios of PE earnings and price to multiple of sales and these kinds of things that everybody else is looking about. You're not advantaged. If you look at it, something that if you find a signal that other people haven't found, you're advantaged. The canonical example that he would talk about is Shane Battier. Shane Battier, when he was on the court, didn't have the best statistics, but he himself would make everybody else's statistics rise. Only through looking at non-obvious correlations of data for recruiting would you find something like that, and people were able to identify, okay, that's the kind of player mosaic we need on the court.
It's like the tension between hard and soft skills.
Right.
And there's no industry like sport that converge those 2 qualities and to the discernment of those, whether coaches or entrepreneurs or executives have to kind of drive that decision and take that bet. But soft skills, again, are especially in sports, you hear about like work ethic and tenacity and resilience and you learn that through the way someone grew up and their attachment style and relationship to their parents, or if they had guardians, or if
Yeah,
they didn't.
deeply psychological, deeply human. So here, I want to talk about another trend, which is, I wonder how many people in this room know how blockchain works? Or know what? Okay, great. NFTs, DAOs. Okay, so some people. So I want to talk about this because it actually ties back to democratization. So really Web3, and maybe I'm going to let Josh explain a little bit more of what this is, but this idea of kind of a decentralized web, the idea of ledgers to transact and verify transactions. And really, it's unleashed a new potential for fan ownership and for people to get behind teams. So talk a little bit about where the technology is going and how that might impact sports and fans and athletes.
Let's make a distinction between what I would consider intersubjective stuff and objective stuff. Intersubjective is it depends upon me believing that you believe, that he believes, that she believes ad infinitum.
Right.
That is stuff like NFTs, when you saw all this craziness around Bored Apes, and it's art. It's things that people are basically speculating, other people will speculate on, and it's not necessarily objective. Objective is if I gave you a 56K baud modem to get on the internet and I gave you a fiber optic cable, it doesn't matter what anybody believes. One is objectively better than the other. The laws of physics say that. So when you look at protocols, when you look at certain infrastructure on the computing side, that to me is the most interesting stuff because it doesn't depend upon human belief. One of the things that Paul was saying earlier was about Facebook's rise, 08, 09. If you think about the canonical riff against Facebook, it was that either you buy the product or you are the product.
You are the product, yeah.
And at Facebook, you are the product. And the incentives of the network have perverted a lot of things, from democracy to serving you up ads and narrowing your scope of what you can be interested in. What some of these distributed networks say is, let's give ownership back to the people that are part of the network that are contributing to it, rather than just being consumed and monetized by it. So that means that you could have players that are owners of leagues through different mechanisms. That means certification of goods so that you can avoid counterfeits. And it's basically the network reconciling the network. So you have constant checks amongst things. And it's done technologically through protocols.
Yeah, so effectively what this means is all of a sudden you could have even something what's called a decentralized autonomous organization, or a DAO, where a bunch of fans could get together and say, you know what, we're going to own a piece of XYZ team, or maybe a Premier, I don't know if you'll ever allow this, but a Premier League, and we should talk about what you guys are doing in this space. And people kind of contribute to the system, and as they contribute to the system, other people are verifying that, yeah, you did show up, you were at that game, and you're gonna get a certain amount of increased value in the thing, in the team or in the athlete. And that value creation then can go back to fans. This is a new system, like a new ecosystem, which is happening, which is a little, not as philosophical as I think it sounds up here, but I'd love to know practically how, Paul, you're implementing this in the Premier League.
The way that, and there are plenty of, it's super complex, but the way that I try to digest what Josh just said is, and the difference between like Web3, Web2, and all the way down, is really just blockchain tech. And what that does is just create a level of security that goes beyond the secondary market. So for us, we look at Web3 from an NFT standpoint in two ways. The first is that, and you see this in the NBA with Top Shot and stuff, Top Shot, is that you can create these digital assets that can trade, much like a trading card that your fan has. And then in the secondary market, if you look at the history of collectibles, they tend to increase in value, sometimes at a multiple, and they swing around. And so the rights holders, whether it's the league, and we're doing our own NFTs that our fans are buying and trading, we get a piece of each of those trades because of the blockchain tech. And then if you have athletes that are doing their own, like Tom Brady launched his autograph service with other athletes, they do the same thing. They're essentially being their own rights holders. So that's number one from a revenue standpoint. Number two is still early innings. We're talking about creating ownership. One of the things that we pay attention to in our Discord is how many fans, largely because of our documentary and other things we've done being in early stage startup sports leagues, they want ownership. And so there's a world where, especially in like single entity startups, where that could be transferred through NFTs, still figuring it out, different than IPOing. Different than creating stock options, but we did launch a Premier Pass in April 2021. We called it a Premier Pass, where it was 8 NFTs providing utility, and so they were bid on in auction, and so 8 people got them for each of our 8 teams, and they got a conversation with Mike and myself, who were co-founders of the league. They got to meet with the coaches of their team. If their team won, they got a championship ring. So there's some fun stuff that you can play around with from a utility standpoint with NFTs.
So here's the thing. I mean, traditionally, I think, there's a lot of aspects of ownership in sports. There's vanity ownership, there's access, like what Patreon really did, which was allow people to have more and more access as fans to their creators or to their athletes, as it may be. A lot of people, like just looking at this room, you know, NFTs are hot right now. Crypto, we've seen was hot. It's had a bit of a fall off along with tech stocks. I'm curious, Josh, what's your advice to people in this room about how they should approach technologies that seem uncomfortable, different, distant right now, but may not be distant because, you know, kids and celebrities are in on it, which is probably a leading indicator of whether or not they'll be.
Well, I'll give you 2 answers, and in preview, one is look at the Amish and look at the young. A lot of people have a view that the Amish actually like don't use technology. You know, I grew up going to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and read Marvel. You know, they actually are very deliberate about how they look at technology. They sort of put it they have a few people using it, and they test it and see how it affects socially. And so that's an interesting way, which is almost like a slightly precautionary principle to understand how it might affect the social dynamics. Because it's always interesting to think about, the key question to ask is not what happens when a technology exists, but what happens when everybody has one. That's the really hard part to get. What's hard with social media, what's hard with mobile technology, et cetera. The second piece is follow the kids. Almost every technology that we use today was adopted, not by the older generation, but by the younger. And that was true of video games, it's true of mobile, it's true of crypto, it's true of whatever is coming next, AR, VR, et cetera. And I always say that in investing, people say that the most dangerous words are, this time is different, because it never is. The most valuable words are whenever a parent says, it'll rot your brain, because it always predicts the next $10 billion industry. You know, rock and roll in the 60s and 70s, and video games in the 80s and 90s, and TV and internet chat
So
rooms.
what's rotting brains now?
It's video games. And you look at that, by the way, in the GPUs, the graphic processing units that let us render real-time multiplayer graphics at real time, are the engine, the soul of the new machine for all the AI and ML apps that are then going back into all the stuff that we've been talking about.
Yeah, so Paul, I want to talk to you. So it is video games right now, the rotting brain concept. All of my friends who are parents tell me this. This has been seen as a threat to a lot of the businesses maybe in this room, or you know, kind of physical play businesses in particular. Is that the right way to think about it, Paul, or are there opportunities in what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are opportunities. You know, I was playing analog video games, and my parents probably argued it was rotting my brain when I was younger too. But I was learning about sports and learning about how to kind of tap into creative problem solving and such. So it depends. And in perspective, as well as how much you're consuming,
right.
That balance. I think there's 60 million people a day playing League of Legends, and you know, we'll probably be at 1 billion gamers over the next few years worldwide. That number is continuing to dwarf sports participants, which is kind of what I look at, and how can we continue to maintain growth year over year around sports participants while keeping esports, just using esports because I think it connects to sports more than gaming, an important part of the experience. And I think that's what we have to be mindful of as leaders, is that the gap continues to grow than what's happening. And I'll just give you an example on gaming, and then I'll shift over to a message I think is important. FIFA helped me understand global football more than anything else. It's complicated. There are leagues all over the world, and then at some point they all get together based on how they finish in the top 4 and play in the Champions League. And then you learn about personalities, you learn about culture in a way if you're curious, and you're playing Real Madrid versus Chelsea. Like, well, what are the differences between these groups? And that was a fun utility for me about learning. There's education tied to gaming. It's not all mind rotting. And I think a sport like lacrosse could really benefit from that mass education because it is a complicated game. Now, when it comes to reasons why kids drop out of sport, there are 3 of them. The first is that they're outskilled, right? And the reason why I think soccer is the global game is you just have a ball. It can be anything. It can be a cantaloupe. It can be a soccer ball. And it's amazing because you can just kick. And one of the things we learn when we grow is we crawl and we walk and we move our feet. So it's amazing. Sports like lacrosse and hockey and golf are more technical, so you're going to drop off. The second reason why people drop off is that they're not having fun. And I think that's an incredibly important thing to remind ourselves, because as privatized sports continue to grow, so is a hyper-competitive environment and this peer pressure tied to making the club team versus me growing up in a rec sport, kind of more open environment. And the third is actually size. And so if you look at youth participants, it's 6 to 18. There are about 60 million players in the US playing different sports or fitness activities, and we all grow at different sizes. And the traditional way about building teams is saying, okay, let's put the 6 and 7-year-olds together, let's put the 8 and 9-year-olds together, and that may not make sense for your respective team. So really great coaches digging into the details on the field, and aside from all the off-field stuff, is so important for our games to continue to grow. And from an accessibility, what Benita talked about, all the way down to from a profitability standpoint, it's actually, in that area, they're both aligned.
I'll give you a directional arrow of progress that I feel very strongly about, and it has to do with the social dimension. The social dimension, a friend, John Haidt, who has written about the coddling of the American mind.
Yes.
And he has attributed very clearly to the rise of terrible things, from the rise of suicides for teenage girls to the rise of Facebook and social media in particular. And he's done a great job diagnosing the issue, and he's got a lot of articles and books that are going to be coming out.
Yeah, this is Jonathan Haidt at New York University.
And if you ask him, what's the prescription? You did the diagnosis, what do we do? And he has one simple thing: kids have to get back outside. Kids have to get back outside, and as a parent of 3, in dusk, on league apps, my life is basically run on Gmail for my firm and league apps to getting my kids around.
Yeah.
I would be very long, all of you in this room, because there is going to be a social trend to get kids back outside. It will become a national movement, and I think you're all going to be really well positioned.
Yeah. So I wanted to end with that. So one prediction and one hope, which actually you just naturally gave me, Josh. So I'm not going to ask you for one. But Paul, what is your
I
one
predict he's going to get to $4 billion.
I think he's going to get to $4 billion. One prediction and one hope for youth sports.
Well, I'll give a prediction that for youth sports, my hope is that what we had just talked about, that we continue to put an emphasis on coaching relationship and investment into great coaches at the earliest level. It's a trend that's happened overseas in football. And whether it's in Spain, we'll use that as an example, they invest the highest amount of margin related to coaches' salaries into the youth coaches. And in America, we kind of do it the opposite. The most sophisticated coaches coach at the pro level and college level. So it is a significant bet, but it's a bet into the future. So make bets on your coaches, spend a lot of time with them. And if we do that, I know that we will eclipse the downward trend. In fact, it's starting to already happen if you look at 2016 to where we are 2022 from participation. And then what I'd also encourage is multiple sports. The reason I got to where I did for so long as a tenured pro athlete is I was able to tap into different skill sets from different disciplines that I grew up playing all the way through high school. And the relationships that I built in different locker rooms with different types of players and different coaches across different disciplines. I think it's really important.
Yeah. Great. I think we're out of time. So thank you guys for being here, and thank you to everyone for listening.
Thank you.